What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe.
And Amy.
Review. It is our weekly show where we review the magic stories as they're posted on Wizard's website, and pretty soon as they're delivered to us in our inboxes from Del Rey Books or whatever the heck it is. But for now, still as posted on Wizard's website, and so this week we are reviewing War of the Spark Ravnica, Operation Desperation by Greg Weisman. So if I recall correctly, I believe this is the second to last of these, but my quick review at the top is there were parts of this story that were okay. In comparison to the past few weeks, I can say that might make it one of the better ones, if not the best one. And yet there are the same issues as previous times that we've discussed. And so, in general, I still would not recommend that you read this story if you have ever read the book or are ever planning on reading the book, because then you should just read the book. It's a better use of your time.
Yeah.
Amy, what about you?
Yeah, definitely read the book. Short review. Meh. Not terrible.
Right.
I'll give it that.
Right.
But just meh.
Well, I mean, parts of it were terrible.
You're right. But fewer parts were terrible than previously.
Yes.
I can say that.
That's fair. So if that glowing review from the two of us makes you actually interested in reading it, and or, as we've said in the past, if you want to form your own opinion without just listening to us, you are more than welcome to do so, and we encourage you to do so. And if you don't know where to find those stories, the link is down in the description below. Check it, and it will take you to that story so that you can go read it for yourself, and like I said, form your own opinion, and then come share that opinion with us and see how it compares and contrasts with ours.
Right.
So, on to the full review itself. This story, as with past stories, have been broken up into parts. This one is in 4 parts, which kind of goes more along the lines of what we've been seeing traditionally. I think last week there were more parts than that, but that was due to what was discussed last week, so that makes a bit of sense. But this week there were 4 parts, and the first part was actually pretty interesting, at least parts of it were, because we actually had Rat talking about, or giving some insight into, her feelings regarding Hekara's death. And we talked about that maybe in the second or third story, that we actually got some thoughts from her, but it was very minimal. And I think you had kind of commented that you wanted to see more, that it wasn't really shown to us as well. It was just kind of her saying, I'm upset about this. And that was kind of, they just skimmed the surface and then moved the hell on. And this time we got a little bit more information and stuff that we had gotten none of in the book, which is where Rat specifically says that because she's not typically seen by other people, she doesn't have to see them reacting to her feelings. And so to her, she can kind of hide, and her feelings don't have to really be real in that moment because she's the only one who's feeling them, so she can kind of pretend or push them off. But if other people notice her feelings and react to them, then they become real. Which, I will say, was a good thing because then later on in the story, that happened where her emotions were realized by the people around her. But, and we'll get to this in a minute, they immediately ruin it. So, which is unfortunately unsurprising.
All right.
But that was a good thing in that first part. The bad thing in that first part, because that first part would have been great all the way through, except, and we kind of touched on this last week, I think I was the one that mentioned it, but regardless, the fact that she refers to everyone as Mr., Master, Mrs., Mr., it is, and when you are now getting to this end portion of the story, it becomes so goddamn tedious to go through all of these characters where just calling them by name is tedious enough, but now you have to do each of their individual titles as well because it's Rat, and it just makes me want to throw the computer out the damn window when I'm reading this. It's so
really
tedious.
Bad. you feel like you're just reading a phone book.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I guess somewhat appropriately, that is also mirrored towards the end of the story. It's just that the first part is mirrored towards the end and we liked that and then they messed it up. But this part we didn't like and gets mirrored towards the end and we still didn't like it. So it's...
And we continued not to like
right.
it.
Which I guess is still appropriate for storytelling where you're able to bring it back full circle. It's just that it's a bad thing that you brought back.
Bring back things that aren't terrible, please.
Which they did, and then did something to ruin it. And like I said, we'll get there in part 4. But so that was part 1. A good thing, and then immediately a bad and very frustrating thing. Part 2, the good thing, more discussions of her feelings with Hikara, which again, I say that kind of glossing over it, but it is good. It's cool to see it because again, it's more of us being shown it. Like she's somewhat self-reflective on it, so she's kind of telling us, but at the same time, that's her way of showing it to us is by going through those thought processes in her head of like, well, you know, it's not a big deal to me, but it is kind of a big deal, you know, and so we get to kind of see that conflict within her as she's just kind of narrating to us as opposed to through her interacting with others, which again, presumably based on Rat's character makes a bit of sense.
Right.
Because I believe it was Dwayne in our comment section, and I don't want to misattribute a comment, but I believe it was Dwayne who said that Rat is used to talking to herself because of the fact that she doesn't really people don't really see her, so it kind of makes sense that a lot of the information we would get about her would come from her being introspective as opposed to through her interactions with the people around her, for example.
And probably also kind of a narration sort of style, because she probably has a lot of self-talk as well. Because if you think about people who don't spend a lot of time with people, they tend to talk to themselves because you start to go crazy if you don't do that. So there's maybe some validity to the way it's written in terms of like the sort of telling narration sort of style versus I'm having a pure thought that's just a thought. You know, it's sort of more like her having a thought and then actually telling the thought.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like instead of you hearing the thought as it's in her head, you're hearing the thought as she's communicating the thought to you.
Right. Yeah, so you feel like it still gives her the opportunity to modify it in some way, or?
Well, absolutely, but I think technically a character could still modify it without that.
Okay.
But my point is that there were so many instances in all of these stories where I was like, the way this is written just doesn't make sense. She's not talking, you know, where she's talking to the audience instead of just living her life and we're in her head, you know? And I had a lot of problems with that. But at this point, it's starting to make a bit more sense, I think. Mm-hmm. Because I'm starting to kind of think about the fact that if she wasn't communicating with people enough, that maybe she talks to herself in that way a lot more frequently than most people do. And so maybe the narration makes more sense than I think it does.
Okay. Yeah. And that, like I said, I feel like that's the most reasonable thing that we have heard and or thought for why it is that way. Mm. We are still through all of this that it's just us kind of trying to resolve why we have such a problem with it, right. Which is either our misgivings with it and or just because that is how it is, right. And it's probably somewhere in between, to be honest. But
or maybe it's just a a kind of a lack of communication coming from them in terms of like what to expect, and so we just were not in the right mindset beforehand.
Right.
I don't know.
So that's the good part of part 2, is still hearing more from Rat, and especially because part 2 dictates Hikara being brought back to life. So you get to hear Rat's feelings on seeing Hikara's body when it's brought in, and then seeing it taken away, and then seeing her come back and be alive and talking, and then the bombshell of her walking right past Rat. And that's where we get the payoff from the beginning, where the other people in the group notice that Rat is, like, upset about the fact that Hikara walked right past her.
Yeah.
And she says, we all realized in that moment, that Hikara didn't recognize me anymore. And so to her, again, as we learned in the beginning, it became real, right? And then, just the best bit of taking something good and just turning it back on the fact that you are forced to write this story the way you have to write this story.
Right.
It immediately, I wrote this down, and I kind of want to read it verbatim because it just makes perfect sense. She was upset that Hikara walked past her, and then immediately brushes it off and starts mentioning that the guilds that they've gathered need to gather, they need to bring them together, and that's their mission.
That was my point. I heard that, and I was so furious.
Yeah.
I was like, there is no way in hell that Rat cares about guilds right now.
Nope.
More than she cares about the fact that Hikara is dead, brought back to life, and now doesn't see her anymore.
Right. And there was that cool moment of the flashback dialogue between Hikara and Rat.
There were a few of those.
I think there were 2 different spots, but one of them was right as Hikara is walking towards her at the end of that part. And then, it's like, oh, she would say this, and I would say this, and then the response is, but none of that happened. She walked right past me. And it's like, that is super impactful. And if you had left it there, if you had ended the part right there, awesome. Like, if you had given us more insight into how she was feeling or how she was reacting, or, being aware that people were looking at her but not caring, that kind of thing. Right. That would be great. That's a really good way of taking that moment and actually making it mean something.
Yeah.
But you have to write the rest of this story. And so then you have Rat being like, well, but I'm going to walk with everybody else because our mission is to gather these guilds together, and we've gathered them all, and so now it's time to... And the only reason that that's in there is to preempt part 4 when it's about to start.
The only reason why it's in there is because the author had to go through that.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
The author was like, well, I'm going to write these cool introspective parts about grief. Oh, well, I'm running out of time. I have to get back on topic, so all about the guilds now. No.
Yeah, no, not even close.
You suck.
Yeah. It was like way to undercut the best part about really any of these stories so far.
Exactly.
You had the coolest moment at Rat's expense, but again, she's a character. We're trying to live through her, right? And see her motivations and personality. And you have this cool moment, and then you just undercut it entirely because you're like, well, we got to move on to the next part of the story. And it's like, no, you don't. Because the next part of the story is a flat retelling of the novel.
Right.
Whereas this was somewhat new. Like, most of it was a retelling. Because it's just gonna be, right? I'm not even talking about it anymore because that's just what it is. I will talk about it towards the end because, hoo boy, I got something to say towards the end.
Oh, no.
But, well, you know what I'm talking about. This was just a way to remind your reader for some reason about the thing that they're going to read in 5 seconds.
Right.
Which, again, it feels like that is a thing that you would do to end a chapter to make people keep wanting to read your book. Mm-hmm. It takes 15, 20, 30 minutes tops to read these short stories. There is no need to try to grab people's attention and keep it from part to part, especially when part 3 was so short. So you're going from part 2 to a very short part 3. there's a psychological thing there where if you look at how short part 3 is, you're like, oh, I could read part 3. So let part 2 be as impactful as it was, and then if you want to put a hook in there, put it in part 3 instead of in part 2. Because part 3 was so short that people would be like, whatever, I can at least read to the end of part 3, and then if you want to put the hook at part 3 so that they stay for part 4, which is, by the way, the last part of the story anyway, then do that. But don't undercut your coolest, biggest moment for this character by being like, oh, but the guilds have to gather now. Why? Why would you do that?
She does not care about that.
No.
Like, the one thing I can say is that time and time again, it's not true to Rat's perspective. It's just not.
Well, and so let's go off of that, because then part 3 happens, and like I said, it's very short. But this is the part where I'm gonna turn it over to Amy for a bit, because.
Well, all I really had to say about part 3 was that everything that got said in part 3 was good information for us to know, and was valuable characterization. It was all good stuff. It's just that it wasn't from Rat's perspective. It's so... It's frustrating, and it's stupid, and it's sad. If you as a writer, right, cannot get in the head of a character enough to actually write from their perspective, why would you try?
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's just a weird imitation of a story. You have to choose. You have to pick what style of writing you're doing. That's like the first thing you learn when you learn how to write stories or even essays or anything, like going to school and learning about literary devices. The first thing you learn is the different types of points of view that you can write from.
Right. Narrators, voices, whatever you want to call it, they're all the same thing.
You have to pick one. You can't just be like, well, I think it's going to be this, but then every once in a while when I feel like it or I have a hard time, it's going to be this one. It doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, if you decide to do something interesting and segmented like that, then it has to actually be segmented. You have to actually break it into pieces where it's clearly defined which sections are one style and which sections are another style. And then you have to, at some point, explain to your readers why you're doing it in multiple styles. You can't just do that and blend it all together and act like that's normal writing. It's not.
You know how you can do that is if you have it from different characters' perspectives, but then you also jump from like third person to first person to whatever, but you can do that when you have different perspectives. If all of your stories, you're shackled to the fact that they're all from Rat's perspective, then you can't switch it up.
Right.
It has to be one or the other, and you just do it uniformly all the way through.
Right.
That's unfortunately or fortunately, depending on what kind of a writer you are, because I feel like what you're talking about would either be a nightmare or a godsend. Right? To some authors, they may be like, please don't make me write from more than one perspective for the same novel or for the same set of short stories. I want to write from one perspective the whole way through and that's it. Or you might have other authors who are like, oh, good, you're giving me the freedom to be able to like switch between like, I know this character's voice, so I'm going to tell it from this character's voice, but I don't really know this character's voice, so I'd rather that we get the insights from them from like a third person omnipotent perspective. Like, that's a good way of looking at it. And I guess, so from your point here, maybe Greg Weisman is not necessarily a great first-person perspective writer.
It seems as though he prefers to write from a narration sort of standpoint where he can say what's happening, but he can't really say what's happening while looking through any one character's eyes. And that is fine, but then write it that way. Don't try to act like it's from Rat's perspective when you can't even use words that Rat would use. Or you can't even consistently use words that Rat would use. Because it's even worse than just using words that Rat wouldn't use to sometimes use words that Rat would use and then sometimes not.
We'll get to that at the end. Don't spoil it, because that's the big thing that pisses me off at the end of this one. But so that's part 3. That got us into that discussion of is it really from Rat's perspective? Because it doesn't seem to be.
It really never was.
Then we're on to part 4. In part 4, similarly to the last part of last week's, it dragged a bit. Because, again, we read this in the novel, so we knew what was going to happen, and there was not a lot of differences here between what happened in the novel and what happened in this story in particular, even to its own detriment. But first, again, we talked in the beginning about how she calls everyone Master and Mister and Ms. and whatever, Mistress and etc. At the end here, they spend an entire paragraph, and they did it in the book, but in the book it's a book, so
right.
You have time to do this. But in this short story, they spent an entire paragraph mentioning each individual guild leader, and the fact that during the ceremony to resurrect Niv-Mizzet as the new living guild pact, that Nissa manipulates the 5 different colored ley lines, and then Rat describes to you every single color and whom is connected by those colors in this collective. Now, in the novel, I thought it was kind of cool because when they did it, they started with, like, in this story, they started with Kaya and ended with Kaya, but they didn't make it a point of saying that it and then ends with her. Because I think at that point, Greg Weisman realized that it was dragging on like crazy, and so he just quickly did it. He was like, oh, and this person and Kaya. And it was like, you started with Kaya, and then you're ending with Kaya, and in the novel, you make it a point of saying, and finally ends back with Kaya again. To let you know that everyone has now been gone to twice.
Right.
In this one, you start with Kaya.
And they're all connected.
Right. You start with Kaya, and you go through, I guess at that point, 20 different iterations, because it's 10 people twice. So you go through 20 different iterations of describing where these lines go, and then you end it by being like, oh, and then this person connects to so-and-so and so-and-so and Kaya. And that's it. You don't even bring it full circle, pun intended, to wrap it up appropriately. You just throw all these names at us because it's necessary, or you had a word limit that you needed to hit, and you're like a college or high school student where you're like, how can I possibly stretch this out further so that I can have all the words that I need and I can turn this in and get paid?
Right. Let me change the 12-point font to 12.2 font, and it'll look like I wrote more.
And I welcome people letting me know that I'm being too nitpicky on these last 2 points, but I'm going to bring them up anyway. First of all, in the book they did this as well, but in the book there's no pictures. In this story there are pictures, which I greatly appreciate. I think that has been something that they've been doing a good job with, which I don't know if I can attribute that to Greg Weisman or if I have to attribute that to the story team from Wizards of the Coast, since they're the ones who are updating it on their website. I don't know either way, but whomever's job it is has done a good job and deserves, in my opinion, praise, because the way that the writing is done, either in the novel and or in these stories, depending on whether it's one of the copied and pasted sections, the pictures seem to pop up in exactly the right place.
Right.
And I mean, the art is fantastic. We all know that.
Right.
And that is attributed to each and every artist and then the art directors as well. But they mention Kefnet's appearance. And Kefnet shows up, and they mention that Kefnet has one arm. They mention it in the book as well.
Right.
And then they show you a picture with Kefnet's 2 arms. And you're like, what?
And I looked at the background, and I said, well, that's not Amonkhet behind him.
Well, and it's God Eternal Kefnet, so this would have been the only time God Eternal Kefnet would have been around. It was not a thing on Amonkhet.
Right.
And I looked at the art very closely. And if you look at the art, there's wrappings around the forearm area, and there's flesh. There's nothing there. It is wrapping around air. So I was like, oh, so that's what they mean. But no, because that's missing on both sides, and both hands are present, and yet in the story they make it a point of when Niv Mizzet cuts off Kefnet's wrist, Kefnet doesn't swing with the other hand because he doesn't have it. He swings with the stump, and then flies away, and Niv Mizzet burns him, and all that other stuff. But you undercut the fact that you, in your story, are saying that he has one arm by immediately putting a picture where he has both. Mm-hmm. So now who messed up? Is the story writer wrong, or is the artist wrong? Did the art director screw up, or did the story writer screw up? Because it's one of them. Right. It's clearly one of them.
Either it has an arm or it doesn't. I mean...
And it's not even like you can say, well, he has one, that they said he had one less arm, and oh, he just had 3 last time, which is also blatantly not true.
Right.
But, no, you specified that he had 1 arm, and then you show a picture with 2. Is that nitpicky? I don't think so, because I think that what it does, to be honest, is with these stories being as poor as they are,
yeah,
you're just dragging the art into it now.
Right.
Because the art's great.
You're just taking more and more pieces of the product as a whole that are great and just dragging it down the hole with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just spreading the mud everywhere.
And last but not least, the thing that fumed me the most in this story, the absolute most, and it goes to almost everything we've talked about today, about Rat's perspective and what she knows and what she doesn't know and what's told to us that she knows but then is shown to us that she doesn't know, or vice versa. Kefnet shows up, and I wrote this quote down because, oh boy, it pissed me off. Kefnet shows up, and she says, Rat says that she sees Kefnet, and it's one of the god creepies that she calls him. She says, a kind of bird-shaped head. That's a quote. A kind of bird-shaped head. Okay? Which is fine.
Right.
It looks like a bird. That makes sense. It's got a long beak. It's got the little round head. It looks like a bird. Okay. That's from Rat's perspective. Makes perfect sense. Rat's never seen this thing before, besides the one time where it showed up, right, and helped rip apart Vitugazi, and that was it. She's otherwise never seen this thing this up close before. Makes perfect sense. Then, 2 sentences later, a paragraph later maybe, specifies the ibis-headed creepy. You don't know what an ibis is. You don't, because you called it kind of bird-shaped. Nope. You don't know what an ibis is. You don't. You couldn't possibly. But in the novel, when the novel was written, whether this portion of the novel, I genuinely don't remember whether it was from Kaya, Ral, or Teo's perspectives. I believe it was Teo, but I could be wrong about that particular portion. But when that portion of the novel was written, that person called Kefnet ibis-headed.
Right. And that makes sense.
Right.
Because it's 2 different people.
Right.
Some people know what an ibis is, and some people don't. Until you read that line, I would have said, it's a kind of bird-shaped head.
I would have known ibis, but I wouldn't have remembered the word. It's just that when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that's what it is.
Right,
yep.
That's my point. Like, when you read it, I was like, oh yeah, that was an ibis. But when I'm standing there seeing the thing in front of me and it's swinging at me, yeah. I'm not going, oh, look at that ibis. I'm going, oh, there's a weird bird thing trying to hit me.
But so when reading it in the novel, all that I got from that portion was that whomever was reacting to the fact that Kefnet was present knew what an ibis was.
Right.
Because they didn't first say the bird-headed thing and then the ibis thing.
Right.
No, they just said, oh, the ibis-headed God Eternal. Well, when you copy and paste portions of your story and then Control F to find the word God Eternal and then change it to God Creepy or whatever in this, the ibis-headed creepy, sure, you're going to mess that up because you're not actually reading through it.
Right. And because seemingly you don't care.
A few episodes of JaAR ago, for a few stories ago, I mentioned that the work was lazy. It was lazy. And I will tell you all that I felt bad about having said that. I thought that might have been a little harsh.
I did too.
And yet now, I completely agree with Past Joe. Completely agree with him. And I will tell myself from the past to now not feel guilty about saying that it was lazy. It's lazy.
And I tried to be the devil's advocate. I tried to
And I don't
grasp
blame
at
you.
straws to
I don't blame you.
come up with reasons why it would be deliberate or okay in some way. And now I'm sitting here going, yep, it was lame and lazy and stupid, and you obviously don't care that much.
It's lazy. It's genuinely lazy. And you know what sucks? This is a lot deeper than I want to go, so I'll touch on it very briefly. There are a lot of discussions these days about people's personal lives blending in with their work lives, and or people advocating for someone to lose their job over something that has occurred with them outside of their job. That makes me feel bad when I see things like that happening, whether I feel that that person is a good person or not at all a good person. That's just me. I don't like that because it's very, I appreciate having a job, and I appreciate the being able to provide for us and for in our lives. It's really important to me.
And things done outside of your job don't necessarily affect things in your job, and so therefore.
Right, and again, I'm not looking to turn this into a big discussion on that point.
Right.
The only point I wanted to make is I work very hard. Amy works very hard. We know many, many people who work very hard in their lives at the jobs that they have, and other people who work very hard and are very intelligent who can't hold on to jobs. Someone got paid for this. It's copied and pasted lazy garbage, and it's really frustrating to read it and realize that money that arguably, and again, I don't want to pull the I pay your salary because I hate that too a lot, but at the same time, we pay into this hobby, to this company that produces these products, whether written, cardboard, digital, or otherwise.
And the reason why we do is because we care about it.
Correct. And then portions of the money that those of us that are here spend go to paying for this. Why? I wouldn't pay you for this. You copied and pasted something that you did already. Did the novel deserve for someone to get paid for it? Yes. Yes, 100 million times yes. We haven't reviewed the novel yet, and we will get there, but yes, the novel is very worthy of all the money that is owed to the person who wrote that novel and anyone that contributed on it. Editors, people who helped with the background prior to that story, etc. That is well earned and well deserved.
Yes.
These stories, on the other hand,
Are not.
you copied, you pasted, you Control F'd to change words here and there, and then you added in, I don't know, so far out of the 5 stories that we've read, maybe 4 paragraphs of new material, maybe, that wasn't mostly grasped from the story.
And it didn't even it didn't correspond correctly with the rest that was already there, because what was already there doesn't actually make sense to be there. Some of it
was good. Some of the new material was good, and we we have given credit where credit is due because we always try to do that with that. But this is where we are. And I think we have one more week of this, to be completely fair. Now, I will say, we have not gotten a chance to read it yet, but we were sent the first chapter from, I believe his name is Django Wexler. Again, we have not read it yet, but from Django Wexler's prequel Ravnica stories, or War of the Spark stories. And from prominent figures in the Vorthos community, I have heard positive things. I am, because of that, very much looking forward to reading these prequel stories. I will point out, I don't know that I've heard a lot of people talking about these stories. And so, besides people within our circle who watch our videos or comment on Reddit or on Twitter or in the comment section, that I've seen. But otherwise, people aren't really talking about these stories. And it's, again, I mean, someone paid for this.
Yeah.
They got paid to do this work. And I'm reading these. And honestly, somebody commented last week and said, thank you for doing this so that we don't have to, or something to that effect. And or no, saying like, thank you for slogging through terrible stuff. And I responded and said, we do it so you guys don't have to.
Yeah.
That's the only reason why I'm doing it at this point.
Right.
I have always said that I will give every story a chance. And it's true, because again, I'll talk to you about stuff that I thought was cool. I'm not going to start the video and go, it was crap, don't read it, and then turn it off and end the video and post it and be like, well, good JaAR, everybody.
Terrible, the end.
It deserves attention, it deserves discussion, but it's...
And that's why we like when you guys comment on it too. If you think that us sitting here saying it's crap is a load of crap, please tell us, because 100%. That conversation isn't a conversation if it's just one-sided.
Yeah, and again, I always welcome new thoughts and new perspectives. Again, we talked about it earlier. Again, if I'm incorrectly attributing it, but I believe it was Dwayne who said, who mentioned a reason for why Rat may be being written the way she is. And that is a new way of looking at it that we hadn't considered. And so where it is appropriate, it's something that I think of now. Because it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe that is the case. Okay. I don't necessarily always agree, but I don't necessarily flat out disagree. I'm not like, well, that's dumb. Because I think that it makes sense. And in certain instances, it can. In other instances, as we've talked about, it's just kind of blatantly egregious and not acceptable. And then you just point out more that it's copied and pasted, and you make me angry about it. But other times, it could make a bit of sense. So this is where we are at this point with these stories. Like I said, I believe there is one more next week. If not, we will be back next week regardless, because we've got lots of stuff to cover. So definitely stay tuned. There are these chapters that are being revealed to us now from the prequel novel, or prequel stories, or whatever you want to call it. There is the novel itself for us to review. We are almost done reading it, and so we will be able to get that out to you. There's something special I want to try to do with that. There's a third person I have to talk to first, so if that doesn't work out, then you won't see it, and me being vague will mean nothing to you. But we will, either way, we will be back next week with another episode of JaAR here on Geek for All. And hopefully you will be back to join us as we continue to go through these stories, if they are to continue, the prequel stories as they are being revealed and released to us, and the novel, to join all of you in showing off our...
#Vorthos Pride.
Sorry, it was a bit of a long walk to get there this week. But that's going to be it for this week. Like I said, we hope that we see you all next week for more JaAR. Feel free to click the subscribe button when it pops up. We have been putting up a lot more MTG Arena content.
Yes, we have.
So definitely stay tuned to the channel for that. There might be something coming up soon. So keep your eyes peeled. Definitely subscribe. Definitely follow us on Twitter.
Yes.
And or Facebook. Check down in the description box below. But on Twitter, we are at Geek4AllYT. And you can search Geek for All on Facebook and you will find us there as well. So definitely follow us there. You will find out about any fun things that are coming up that might be going on that you might want to keep an eye open for. So, but, as I said, from the Geek for All YouTube channel, I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.